So my talk is supposed to be genetics in CMT, but I'm going to do a little bit more genetic counseling in CMT. And borrowing a phrase from Mike Shy, I'd say that genetic counseling is genetics with some rational thought included in it. So I'll kind of go through genetics and inheritance, but I think some of the more exciting things that are happening right now are in genetic testing. And I think that's where a lot of questions are coming up. So I wanted to spend some time on that, but I don't have a lot of it, so I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can, but to still give you all the information you need. So we typically have 46 chromosomes in nearly every cell in the body. The chromosomes contain all of the information our body needs in order to grow and develop and function properly. And they can be arranged based on their size in these black and white stripes into pairs, so that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We get one member of each pair from our mothers and the other member of each pair from our fathers. Likewise, when we have children, we pass along one member of each pair, and our partner passes along the other member of the pair. The first 22 pairs are exactly the same in males and females. So they contain all the same information, they contain all the same genes. The only place that we differ is in the last pair, which are the sex chromosomes. So females have 2 X chromosomes. These are down here. And males have an X and a Y chromosome. So we have 46 chromosomes, but we have 20,000 genes. So they're really, really small, and they're arranged all along the chromosomes. And just like we have 2 of every chromosome, we have 2 of every gene. So you have chromosome from mom, chromosome from dad, gene from mom, gene from dad. Our genes are made up of DNA, which is essentially just a code. It's a series of letters that, when it's spelled correctly, lets that gene do its function. And every gene has a specific function in the body. In CMT, most of the genes have to do with the myelin or the axon, or getting some of the energy from the mitochondria to actually make these things work. So what happens in most in a lot of CMT is that there's a change in this code, so that C could be a T, or a couple letters could be inserted in, or a couple letters could be missing. Any change in that code is what we call a variant. We used to call this a mutation. We are kind of going away from that word. Variants may be pathogenic and disease-causing. They may be benign and not disease-causing. You may have seen on genetic testing results variants of uncertain significance, and that's kind of like the worst case scenario in my line of work, but that's coming up too. So any variant in the code may or may not cause the gene to work properly. If the gene isn't working properly, that's when a person may have a condition such as CMT. There are 3 main modes of inheritance in CMT. There's also potentially mitochondrial, but I'm not going to get into that today. So the 3 main modes are autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, and X-linked. And in a family, if you have one type of CMT, that is going to be true for everyone else in your family that's affected. So if one person has genetic testing and it's positive, and someone else has CMT, you have the same type of CMT. You have the same inheritance pattern. There are very few families that there's more than one type of CMT that's running through, and that might be the only exception to that sentence, but in general, just assume that everyone in the family has the exact same cause of their CMT. So the word autosomal, before I get into this, just means that it's the same, there's an equal chance of being affected whether you are male or female, and there's an equal chance of passing it on if you are male or female. So dominant inheritance means that you have to have a change on only one copy of the gene in order to be affected. It means that the other copy of the gene does not have a change on it. So that would be this person here. This is one gene that does not have a change, and this red bar would be a change that's on the other copy of the gene. In terms of the inheritance, a person will pass on one copy of their gene in each pregnancy. Their partner will pass on the other copy. So in every pregnancy, there's 4 possibilities. This could be passed on, and this. This is very hard to do with a little pointer. It's much faster when I have my finger in my room. Anyway, so there's 4 possibilities. And as you can see, 2 out of 4 of them will mean that a child has inherited the condition. If a person inherits it, that means that they will have CMT. They will have symptoms. We won't necessarily be able to predict what those symptoms are, but that person will also have the same 50-50 risk of passing it on in the future. If a person does not inherit it, though, that person will not have CMT, will not have symptoms, and cannot pass it on in the future. It stops. This is what we might see if we're looking at a family history of CMT in a dominant form. So you can see that every generation is affected. You can see that it doesn't matter if a father is passing on to a son, or a father is passing it on to a daughter, or a daughter is passing it on to a son. Any combination of that can occur. It's also possible to be the first person affected in the family with a dominant condition, and then the pedigree would look very different, but, I guess I should say squares are males, circles are females. So the second most common type of inheritance in the United States is X-linked. So the dominance, maybe about 80% of people will have a dominant form of CMT. X-linked is maybe 10 to 12. And in this condition, it does actually matter if a person is male or female in terms of the way that it's being passed on. So in this case, recall that females have 2 X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y chromosome. If mom is the one that has an X-linked form of CMT, she probably is going to have fewer symptoms than the males that are affected in her family, but she has CMT. And she has symptoms, most likely. 90% of women with CMT type X have symptoms. So I've heard a lot of people have seen people in the past and they've been told, oh no, you couldn't have symptoms because you have this X-linked form and you're a female. And that's not true. I mean, women have symptoms and they should be treated just as appropriately as the men in the family. So for women who have an X-linked form of CMT, they will pass on one or the other of her X chromosomes in each pregnancy, and with the same 4 ways of passing on the X or the Y chromosome, you can see that for women it's actually 50-50 if their child is going to have the condition, whether it's a male or a female. So she's got a 1 in 4 chance of having an unaffected daughter, 1 in 4 chance of an unaffected son, 1 in 4 chance of a daughter with CMT, and 1 in 4 chance of a son with CMT. For men, it's a little different because in order for them to have a daughter, they have to pass on their X chromosome. In order for them to have a son, they have to pass on their Y chromosome. So for men who have an X-linked form of CMT, they will pass on that X chromosome, they'll pass on CMT to all of their daughters, 100% of their daughters. They will pass on their Y chromosome and no CMT to all of their sons. So for men who have an X-linked form of CMT, it's 100% of their daughters will be affected and 0% of their sons. So in this picture, you can see at the very top, there's a man who's affected. He's passed it on to both of his daughters, not to his son, but his daughters have passed it on either to son or daughter. It doesn't make a difference. Recessive inheritance is not all that common in the United States. It's maybe around 5 to 10% of the population. But in this case, what happens is a person needs to have a variant on both copies of their gene in order to be affected. So neither copy of the gene is working properly. And so that's the bottom right corner of the screen. For that, it means that their parents have to be carriers. Most of the times, carriers have no signs, symptoms, any changes that would make them think that they had anything. They never know that there's something in the family until they have a child that's affected. So for most carriers, it means they have a change on one copy of the gene and not on the other, and then they usually have no symptoms. They have the same way of passing things on, so they have a 1 in 4 chance of having a child that's an unaffected non-carrier, a 2 in 4 chance of having a child that's a carrier like themselves, and we would not expect them to have any symptoms, and a 1 in 4 chance of having a child that's affected in each pregnancy. For a person who has a recessive form of CMT, if in the United States, if they're not marrying someone from their family, if they're not marrying someone who has a close ancestral tie to them, the most likely scenario is that their partner will not be a carrier and will not have the same type of CMT that they do. So for a person who has a recessive form of CMT, the most likely scenario is that all of their children will be carriers and will not have CMT themselves. And this is what we tend to see in recessive inheritance. One person, maybe siblings that are affected, and that's it. However, this is a little deceptive because, like I said, with dominant inheritance and truthfully with X-linked inheritance too, you can be the very first person in your family that's affected. So just seeing this by itself doesn't mean to me much of anything other than you don't have a family history. So we take that type of information and we put it into these various types of CMT. And I am very grateful to John for going over what demyelinating and axonal means because I don't have time for that. But I'm going to take that piece of it and put it into terms. So CMT type 1 is any kind of a autosomal dominant and demyelinating form of CMT. Type 2 is any form of an autosomal dominant and axonal form of CMT. Type X just means it's inherited on the X chromosome, and type 4 means that it's a recessive form of CMT. Both X and 4 could have any type of conductions with it. But how does that help us? That really can help us with guiding genetic testing and what we think is the most reasonable and rational approaches to doing genetic testing. So genetic testing means going through the genes and seeing what the sequence actually says. So that letter sequence and going through it and seeing if it changes at all from what's expected. There's probably about 80 genes right now that have been associated with CMT. Truthfully, my guess is that 100 more are going to be found before we're done and we actually have answers for people. So there's a ton of genes that are potentially going to be implicated in CMT, and we're not doing testing for all of them. So it can get really tricky to figure out these pieces of things. And whether or not genetic testing even needs to be done is a really important question. So, the pros of genetic testing. I think the biggest pro of genetic testing is this information piece of things. So anticipatory guidance means that if we know what you have, we might be able to tell you what to expect in the future. If we know that you have CMT1A, we can tell you that 95% of people with CMT1A never need a wheelchair full time. If we don't know you have CMT1A, we can't tell you that. So being able to give you information about the future can be really helpful for some people. You can also use this to determine if there's other family members at risk just based on the inheritance pattern. There are a lot of trials that I think are on the horizon, but at the moment they're all based on the genetic results. So it's going to be specific to whatever specific form of CMT a person has. So if you don't have genetic testing, we don't know what type of CMT you have, chances are you're not going to be eligible for a clinical trial. The psychological impact of actually having that definitive diagnosis is an important one. I think that there's a lot of people who still they may have had genetic testing, but it's been negative, and they have doctors that are questioning whether or not this is truly CMT, or is there something else that's going on, and maybe are doing a bunch more testing and getting MRIs and getting EMGs every year, or whatever it might be. And being able to put a stop to that can be really helpful for a lot of people. So, and the one thing I've really come to realize over the last couple of years is the sense of community that I think happens in the CMT world, where I feel like probably a lot of you guys walked in the room today and met someone sitting at your table and said, hey, I'm Bob, I have CMT1A, what do you have? And being able to say, you know, I have this, and this is actually what my cause is, for some people is really empowering, is really important. And I think that that's a very reasonable reason for doing testing, is being able to be a part of that and feel more connected to the group. And of course, family planning is only available for people who have a genetic diagnosis of CMT. So let me go into that in more detail. There are a bunch of different reproductive options. There's prenatal and preconception testing. So prenatal testing would include CVS or chorionic villus sampling and amniocentesis. Non-invasive prenatal screening or testing is on the horizon. It's not quite prime time yet, but I'll just mention it. And then preconception testing is with preimplantation genetic diagnosis. So in both CVS and amniocentesis, a person is pregnant and they take a sample from the pregnancy. So in CVS, they take a piece of the placenta. In amniocentesis, they take some of the amniotic fluid that surrounds the pregnancy. And in both cases, they're able to take cells from the pregnancy and analyze those and see if the familial mutation is present. The implication of this would be if you had a pregnancy that was affected with CMT, you may be considering an abortion or a termination of the pregnancy. Non-invasive prenatal screening is, some of you may have heard of this. It's when they take maternal blood and they try to see, right now they're doing it for like Down syndrome or to determine sex of a pregnancy. And basically what happens is that there is cell-free DNA that crosses the placenta or comes from the placenta into the maternal bloodstream. And they're able to pick that out in some way. This is like outside my realm of laboratory knowledge, but they're able to figure out which is the fetal DNA and which is the maternal DNA. And they can say, okay, there's more copies of chromosome 21, and so this fetus may be affected with Down syndrome. But at the moment, they're not doing this for single gene disorders, such as CMT. My guess is in the next year or so they will be. There's been some stuff that's been going on with this in some other genetic disorders, so I think it may come up. The implication of this is still going to be that if it was an affected pregnancy, it would be the option for termination. So it really does become a question of what is important to you. Is it more important to you to not have a child with CMT? Or is it more important to you to have, whatever it might be. I think that the question of termination is an important one to know before you go into any of these tests or screens, because that you may not want that, and that's totally okay. But you should know that before you do the testing. There's also preconception testing. So this happens in conjunction with in vitro fertilization. So in vitro fertilization is when egg and sperm are combined in a petri dish, and they're grown until there's about 8 cells. And the 8 cells then, they're able to take off 1 or 2 cells from that, and they analyze those, and then they see which of the embryos do not have the genetic mutation, which are the green ones in this picture. They would take only those green ones and implant those back into the mother to carry to term. So PGD is a very powerful way to say from the beginning that they're not going to have a pregnancy that's affected. They do usually recommend that you follow it up with a CVS or an amniocentesis to make sure they got it right, since they're getting DNA from only 1 or 2 cells. But it is at least an option. IVF usually runs $10,000 to $15,000 a cycle, and the PGD is usually $3,000 to $5,000 on top of that. So why not get genetic testing? And before I go on, I just have to say this is not my usual cartoon, but I found one that said "Go Blue," so I had to use it because Michigan's playing in a few hours. So in terms of cons, inconclusive results. Okay, so show of hands, who has had genetic testing that's come back as a variant of uncertain significance? There's actually way fewer people right now that have their hands up, but there's probably about 10 people right now that have their hands up. Variants of uncertain significance are exactly that. They are variants that we don't know if it's disease-causing or not. And how we figure that out can take a lot of additional studies, and maybe functional studies. It may take fibroblasts or those skin biopsies. It may take doing testing on other family members, or it may be that we never know. And then you have just like this ambiguous what if, or in my experience, even worse, someone else says to you, oh, this is definitely it. But then I look at the result, I'm like, I don't think this is it at all. And then you have conflicting opinions about what the actual answer might be. Having a negative result or a positive result for some people can be very challenging. Negative result, it may be putting still into this diagnostic odyssey box. For a positive result, for some people, it's like you took away my last hope that this isn't CMT. And that can be really powerful too. There is a lot of testing that is available right now, but there's a lot of testing that we don't have available right now. So like I said, there's probably going to be 180 genes that will cause CMT. Right now, the lab that's doing the most is doing 70 genes. And I'll go through that in a little bit, but not all of them I think are really reasonable for CMT. So what happens if it's negative? It doesn't mean you don't have CMT. It means we didn't find it. So it can be really difficult to go through that as well. Genetic discrimination is something that a lot of people bring up. There is protection for people who have, so there's healthcare protection and employment protection through HIPAA for people who have symptoms, through GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act for people who do not have symptoms but have had positive genetic testing results, and the Affordable Care Act protects people against being discriminated against for pre-existing conditions. There is no federal protection for long-term care, life, or disability insurances. So if a person doesn't have a diagnosis of CMT and then they get such a diagnosis, even though we know that CMT doesn't typically affect lifespan, insurance companies don't get that, and you may not be able to get life insurance once you have that diagnosis. So being careful about who, like if there's someone at risk, but they haven't had genetic testing or haven't had even a nerve conduction study, which if you have a slow nerve conduction study and you have a family history of CMT type 1, then guess what? You've got a diagnosis. So being careful about who's getting that type of thing, I think is a really important position to do as well. Okay, so this is the fun stuff. Genetic testing. So here's my list. This is the list of genes I believe actually cause CMT. They come in 4 columns, so it's like the gene, lab performing, gene, lab performing, gene, lab performing. So there's 4 columns of genes, 4 columns of the labs that are performing. The lab key is at the very bottom of the screen there. And the ones that are in yellow are the genes that are the most common in CMT. So of people who have a positive genetic test result and have CMT, 90 to 95% of them will have a mutation in one of these 4 genes, which means that we're talking about maybe 5 to 10% of people who that have genetic testing that is positive, that is not in one of these 4 genes, which is not a huge percentage. There's another group of people then who have had negative testing results and we don't have an answer, and that's maybe up to a third of people. But the question becomes, if we're going to do genetic testing and it's going to be positive, how much utility is there in doing bigger panels? What's the chance that we're actually going to find something if the data that we've found is, and this has been consistent among many studies at this point, 90 to 95% of people are going to have a change in just one of these 4 genes. So this is also something that we are studying here at Stanford, and hopefully next year we'll have some more results about these new panels, and as they're getting bigger, which of them may have a greater chance of finding an actual variant in other genes, and a variant that we actually think is disease-causing as opposed to unknown significance. I put up the Emory things. These are the other Emory genes that get done. These are ones that I don't believe are real. And then there's these lists of genes that, I don't know, I feel like Dr. Shai and I might disagree on this specific point of it, but these are genes that I would not consider a CMT gene, but are on the panels. And there's some of them that do things like they have a neuropathy as part of the condition. So for example, Fabry disease is a condition that causes kidney issues essentially, but people can get a sensory neuropathy as part of it, so it's on this hereditary neuropathy panel. I don't consider that CMT. And then there's genes like KIF1B, which has been inappropriately assigned as being a CMT gene, but it's not appropriate to do testing for it because it doesn't actually do anything that we know about. But so if you come back with a variant of uncertain significance in a gene that I would say is a gene of uncertain significance, I would know what to do with that because I've worked with CMT for a long time. But what about your general practitioner? Would your general practitioner know what to do with that? And my guess is no. This is the breakdown for the various labs that I know of that are doing the testing. So there's 7 labs, and the genes that they do is in the second panel, and the turnaround time and the cost. So the institution costs are the Stanford costs, and then it's straight through insurance. The one I think I wanted to point out was Prevention does a distal hereditary motor neuropathy panel, so that's just like a specific smaller subset of people who have primarily motor symptoms and not so much sensory symptoms. But the rest of them are really these hereditary neuropathy panels. There are pros and cons to all of these. I would not necessarily argue that bigger is better. It really depends on some combination of what you're presenting with, as well as what your insurance coverage might be, as well as what testing is being done and how it's being covered. So for example, it's only Athena, GeneDx, and Invitae that do the PMP22 duplication testing, which is what causes CMT1A, which is the most common type of CMT. So if you're getting testing for the biggest panel through Emory, then you're gonna miss the most common form of CMT. So last thing would be just to talk about exome testing, because some of you might have heard about this and some of you may have had it. For people who have had negative genetic testing, for some people we are doing exome testing. And the exome are these exons plus the genome. So exons are the part of the gene that are actually coding for protein, and the genome is the entire genetic code. So you put them together and it's the exome. It's kind of like Brad and Angelina's Bradgelina. It's our exome. And so this really covers the 20,000 genes, and it's only about 2% of the genome is actually in the exome, but it's 80 to 95% of known disease-causing mutations are actually found within the exome. So it's a powerful place to look. But you get a lot more information than just maybe what's going through the family, and it really depends on where you're getting this testing. If you're getting through a research lab versus a clinical lab, what type of information you'll get back. There are incidental findings that can come up, things such as cardiomyopathy genes or malignant hyperthermia or cancer genes that could come up that are running through the family. That isn't the reason I'm sending you for an exome. I'm not a cancer counselor. I don't really have the ability to tell you what all these things mean, but if I'm ordering the test, it's my obligation to tell you about them. And that can be a really challenging position to put someone in. The other thing that I just went to a conference last week where they were talking about the success rates of exomes, and the best number I found was that only 1/3 of the exomes actually found an answer. So this is supposed to be kind of like the last line of testing, and it's only 1/3 of them will actually come up with something. So I think it's not always the best answer. I think it can be really tricky to interpret, and you have to have someone who's really good at interpreting it in order for it to be a reasonable test. So with that, I will put this up here. It's our Stanford information, Stanford Healthcare and Stanford Children's Health. If you would like to come and see us, there are phone numbers and email addresses. I might just leave this up instead of my acknowledgement slide. Please come and see us. Thank you.